I'm really delighted to welcome you all to the inaugural session of the third India Forum on China at Goa. It's a great pleasure to be back in Goa for this forum, which is being co-hosted by the Institute of Chinese Studies and Konrad Adenauer Stiftung with the support of Goa University. I would like to warmly acknowledge the support of our principal partners, Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, and the presence of its country head, Mr. Peter Rimmel. Peter and his colleagues have worked very closely with us for the third consecutive year to organize the India Forum on China, and we deeply appreciate it. May I also thank Professor Varun Sani, the proactive, dynamic and learned Vice Chancellor of Goa University. He and his colleagues and student volunteers have been of great help in organizing this forum, and the interest in China is most welcome. We have present with us a galaxy of distinguished participants from academia, diplomacy and policy-making circles who are leading experts in their respective areas. Many of you have traveled overseas. Let me take this opportunity to welcome you all and thank you for partnering with ICS and KAS and Goa University on this forum. Just to give a brief background, in December 2017, the flagship event of ICS, the All India Conference of China Studies, took place in Goa with the support of Goa University. The first India Forum on China was at that time held back to back with the All India Conference. With its success, there was a clear consensus that emerged among the participants that we need to have a standalone international gathering of experts to deliberate on China in the context of India on an annual basis. Thus was born this annual event, which now brings together China experts from India and abroad. The purpose of the conference is to converge international viewpoints with Indian perspectives on the developments in China and the implications for the world and India. It was exceedingly kind of Professor Varun Sani to invite ICS to hold it in this beautiful state of Goa, and I am sure that that is a perfect attraction for all of us to convene here. Goa University's partnership has been valuable, and the conference has been rechristened India Forum on China at Goa. With the third edition of the forum, we believe that we have reinforced and reiterated the importance of this platform. The forum encourages a free and frank discussion in a structured format that is informal and freewheeling. With a select group of speakers and participants, it provides an excellent opportunity to share diverse opinions on China. Over the last couple of decades, China's influence in geopolitics, economy and strategic matters has multiplied manifold, and think tanks, governments and academia are debating on the implications of this expanding footprint. This is not only for Asia Pacific but indeed for the world. For India as a key geopolitical player with aspirations to expand its global presence, the rise of China is a worthy subject of study at a deep analytical level. It's also important for us to examine what the world is thinking about China and the opportunities and challenges this affords for India. At the inaugural session of the forum, we explored China's ambitious strategies of seeking regional and global leadership, especially in the context of the views articulated by President Xi Jinping at the 19th Party Congress in October 2017. Last December, we took the dialogue forward at this forum, which has its theme changing drivers of Chinese economy. This year, India Forum on China at Goa will present perspectives of China and Asia's changing geopolitics. The sub-theme that may be deliberated upon include the China factor in Asia's geopolitical challenges and future order, the Belt and Road Initiative post-second BRF, evolving discourse on Indo-Pacific, China's force projection capability in Asia and beyond, US-China economic and strategic rivalry, China-related aspects of the changing economic landscape of Asia, China's culture, diplomacy and sharp power, and implications for India of all these developments. The third India Forum in China is especially important for us, as this year we are commemorating 50 years of the Institute of Chinese Studies and its precursor, the China Study Group. Over these years, the ICS has gradually carved out a niche for itself as a vibrant research institute committed to promoting interdisciplinary research on China and East Asia, as a meaningful platform to generate public discourse on this region of great significance to us, as an active forum which brings together China scholars, as a catalyst to nurture China studies in India and contribute to capacity building. It gives us great satisfaction that the Wednesday seminars, which commenced in 1969, are continuing without interruption, and our flagship journal, China Report, is in its 55th year of publication. Friends, ICS looks forward to continuing its work with the support of a reservoir of experts and partner institutions. I welcome you all once again, and we will no doubt have most productive dialogue over the next 2 days. Thank you. May I now invite Professor Varun Sani, Vice Chancellor Goa University, to deliver his inaugural remarks. Professor Sani.
Ambassador Shoke Kanta, Mr. Peter Rimene, Mr. Richard McGregor, distinguished delegates, several of whom I consider my mentors, faculty colleagues, student friends, ladies and gentlemen. A very good morning to all of you. My first very pleasurable duty as the local academic dignitary is to welcome you all to Goa most warmly. Welcome to Goa, this lovely land of red soils and verdant green and all of its blue waters. And I hope that you've all woken up this morning just feeling charged up in all sorts of wonderful ways. I'm absolutely delighted that the third India Forum on China at Goa is now at hand. I would like to thank our esteemed partners, the Institute of Chinese Studies and the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, for carrying this whole idea forward. I think it's pretty clear to anybody with even the most superficial understanding of world affairs that China, the presence of China, has become the one inescapable structural reality of our time. And I think we will also agree that China now must be really engaged with in a very broad, wide, multi-dimensional way. China really in some fundamental senses now intrudes. To give you an example of I think about 5 days ago, I was in an event which, like today, I was inaugurating or participating in the inaugural hall, where I made the comment, I thought rather commonsensical, non-controversial, perhaps even trite, that India was unlikely to emerge as a fount of innovation and creativity as long as we had a school system, education in our school system, which sort of did not encourage these extremely important characteristics. And I was amazed that, when the session was over, an elderly gentleman, a very well-known gentleman, came and started to ask me, he said, well, I want to contest that observation of yours. Look at China. They don't encourage in their schools creativity or innovation, and yet China has emerged as and it became just fascinating to see how, in an area which had absolutely, on the face of it, nothing to do with China, here was an argument being made which was all about China and the Chinese school education system. So, in a very real sense, therefore, making sense of China, contemporary China, future trajectories of China has become imperative. And when we sort of think about just one observation on the theme itself, on China and Asia's changing geopolitics, it seems to me, I've written this some years ago, that the rise of China converted a landmass called Asia into a region. The rise of China is what has made Asia a region. If by region we mean a zone of security interdependence. So what was earlier a continent with its surrounding waters became a region because of the rise of China. And I think therefore, understanding China and in the context of Asia's changing geopolitics is absolutely essential. At Goa University, we've had a program for many, many years funded by the University Grants Commission on Latin America. And during my tenure as Vice Chancellor, we have tried with very generous support from the state government to really broaden its ambit. So we've now converted that into a school of international and area studies. We have, of course, Latin America there as well, but we have just advertised the day before yesterday 3 faculty positions in Chinese studies and 7 other positions in international relations, of which 2 will be on sort of European, one each on European studies and South Asian studies. And the intention is to start out here in Goa the serious scholarly study of China. But also China in a broader context, where we will also have our students study international security, international economics, and international law. So, we really are, as a university, delighted that sort of, the India Forum on China at Goa seems to be becoming a regular fixture. One of the wonderful kind of, events that punctuates the Goan winter, as it were, the months of, December, January, and February, where those of us who live in Goa on any given day have 5 different events to participate in. Sometimes potentially, but sometimes if you have a job like mine, you're required to attend, at least 3 of the 5 of them, so as not to offend others. But it's brilliant that sort of one of those events is going to be the India Forum on China. I hope very much that our collective deliberations this year lead us, among other things, to the conclusion that this should continue. So with those words, again, a very warm welcome to everyone in this room, and wish you all, on behalf of Goa University, very fruitful bunch of deliberations, but also a really great time in Goa. And I hope you all have a whole lot of fun out here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Sani, for those remarks. I now invite Mr. Richard McGregor, Senior Fellow, Law Institute, Sydney, to deliver the keynote address. Mr. Richard McGregor is an eminent scholar and former journalist who has written extensively on China and has been critically acclaimed for his books on the subject, especially his first book, The Party, on the inner workings of Chinese Communist Party, which was published in 2010, is considered a masterpiece. Subsequently, he wrote a book on Sino-Japanese relations, Asia's Reckoning, China-Japan and the Fate of the US in the Pacific Century, published in 2017. His most recent book, Xi Jinping, The Backlash, was published most recently in August 2019. He has spent long years in China and elsewhere. He was Bureau Chief of Financial Times in Beijing, Washington, D.C. And we are all looking forward to his keynote address. Richard, over to you.
Great, thank you very much. Thanks for that introduction. Thanks to the sponsors. It's really a great honour for me to be invited to speak to such a distinguished group, quite daunting in fact, but since you have invited me, you're stuck with me for half an hour or so. Now I know this is the China-India conference, but I'm not going to talk about China-India relations. I don't know enough about it. Put another way, I'm here to imbibe the spirit of Wuhan rather than lecture you about it. As an Australian who only after about 30 years away from his motherland only just recently returned there, I'm also not going to talk about Australia-China relations as exciting as they have been in recent years. In the Indian context, I might just say as an aside on Australia-India issues, Australian politicians in recent years have tried to popularise Australia-India relations by talking about the 3 C's that we have in common, supposedly, cricket, curry and the Commonwealth. At the very least, I think I'm going to redefine that here, and I think the 3 C's should be cricket, curry and China. That's much more interesting. Anyway, that's all for another day. What I'm going to try to talk about today is China, specifically domestic politics and Xi Jinping, and the spillover into foreign policy and what that means for all of us here today. Or as the People's Daily might put it, what does Xi Jinping thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era mean for all of us? To that end, I want to divide my speech into a number of different themes. First of all, look at why is Xi, to try and explain the type of leader he is. I think that's important. Secondly, to talk about whether Xi Jinping represents continuity or disruption, or as I might put it, he represents continuity through disruption. In that context, I want to not look at Xi Jinping's power. I think there's an overemphasis on that in many respects, but also look at the legion of critics that he's built up in his 7 years in office. And that was in fact the subject of my last book, The Backlash Against Xi at Home and Abroad. In general terms, obviously, each country has to grapple with China on its own terms, within specific historical frameworks and in different timelines and the like. And to quote Peter Varghese, a compatriot of mine, he likens trends like China's astonishing growth over the past 40 years to waves. In other words, we can see them on the horizon, but we don't know exactly when they will break and in which pattern they will reach the shore. And I'm sure we all understand what he means in that respect. Firstly, now why is Xi? There's been a lot of hand-wringing in the West, perhaps in India as well, in recent years about why people got China and Xi Jinping so wrong. In my view, even the sort of I told you so crowd about China can't really claim to have correctly predicted the kind of leader that Xi Jinping would be. They might claim they're right about the system, but they haven't been right about Xi, the personality. Now, on one level, I think mistakes about Chinese politics are quite unsurprising. First of all, there's a Western bias. Mainstream foreign analysts of China have habitually confused Western beliefs about how Beijing should reform with the party's own convictions about how to govern the country. My favourite word in that respect is reform. I think we all need a new dictionary when we come to China, of course. Reform means one thing for us, it means another thing for them, but we willfully conflate the two. I just think it's taken a long time for people to realize, and Xi Jinping, I think, is very valuable in this respect, that China doesn't want to be like us when it grows up. I might add on that point, though, that in all this self-flagellation about how wrong we've got China, the idea that China might liberalize as it got richer, as it engaged with the West, it might become more open and the like. I don't think that was a dumb idea or a dumb strategy. In fact, I think it was a very good idea and a very good strategy, and I think the CCP recognized it as such. And that's why they pushed back against it so strongly and worked so hard to nullify it using their propaganda campaigns. I just think people took too long to realize that. Now, there's another reason why it's very difficult to get China right, and that is, of course, the system itself. Let's contrast that with the US. Of course, it's axiomatic, I think, that America is over-reported, China is vastly underreported. That sort of contradiction has been accentuated during the time of Donald Trump. With Trump, we have this kind of exercise in radical transparency, except for the tax returns, of course. I think in China it's completely the opposite. We've got a kind of radical opacity. Now, the CCP has always been a traditional communist party. In other words, it's habitually secretive. But I think Xi Jinping has made that even more so. Let me give you a couple of examples. In the last 2 months, a Japanese academic from Hokkaido, who was actually invited to visit China by KAS, was detained allegedly for breaching national security. Now, what was his crime? His crime was buying books in second-hand bookstores on the particular subject that interests him, which is the KMT Nationalist Party rule in China in the 1930s. Now, to be sure, that was a pretext, but still, it's very telling that that could be a pretext for actually, shopping in a bookstore. Luckily, the Japanese made a big fuss, and he got out. Let's take another example, which might sound quite banal, but I think you have to sort of focus on these occasionally just to remind yourselves of the differences in systems, and that is Hong Kong, where we've seen the most extraordinary 6 months now of, weekly, daily protests, often with great violence. For the first 3 months of those protests, Xi Jinping did not say a single word in public about Hong Kong. So that tells you something about the political system, that he could get away with that. Now, obviously, they will be having all manner of debates internally, but none of that surfaced in the process. So that leaves us, I'm afraid, still relying on, peakenology or Kremlinology. So that means, inevitably, we're left in the realm of speculation. Now, such misjudgments about China didn't used to matter much. When China was less powerful. They matter a lot more now. But I really don't think that's the interesting point about how we got Xi Jinping wrong. I would also argue that most Chinese also got Xi Jinping wrong. And that's far more interesting to me. So let's go back to, without delving too much into history, let's go back to 2007 when Xi Jinping was nominated to be the successor to Hu Jintao, taking over in 2012. I was living and working in China at the time, as many of you might have been. Xi's appointment always has the natural element of surprise because the process is closed, like choosing a new pope or something. We had seen some signs beforehand about his elevation in Shanghai. Some foreigners, of course, have Xi Jinping out as a man to watch, most notably Hank Paulson, the then US Treasury Secretary, who travelled to Zhejiang province to see him. Of course, he didn't go to see him as a future strongman. It was more in the likes of, Margaret Thatcher and Gorbachev. Here's somebody we can do business with. An up-and-coming, open-minded Chinese leader. A like-minded person, somebody just trapped in a different political system. Completely wrong, of course. But the point is, I think, that I can't remember anybody in China at the time, in 2007, and indeed the years after that, saying when Xi Jinping took over that this guy was going to absolutely turn the system upside down. That this guy was a new strongman who would completely recalibrate the Chinese system. In other words, we didn't know at the time that we were getting a leader who would no longer be first amongst equals in the Politburo Standing Committee, but we were in fact getting a strongman, a sort of blowback to times past in China. Nobody foresaw, I think, the extent of the anti-corruption campaign. Just remember that, about 400 members of the nomenklatura. If you look in China, I think there are about 3,000 to 4,000 people at that level in the system, so about 400 members of the nomenklatura, including 100 generals, would be detained. And that Xi himself, on top of everything else he's done, would basically end the system that's worked so well for the CCP of 2 5-year term limits and effectively make himself president in perpetuity. So, one of the CCP's great achievements, peaceful handover of power, would be thrown away. So, at the time, in 2007, Xi's elevation, he was seen as a compromise candidate between the. So, I'm not a big fan of binary factional analysis of Chinese politics, but it's definitely true at the time. We had tussles at the top, broadly speaking, between the so-called Shanghai Gang and the outgoing faction, the China Youth League. And he was acceptable to both of them. He was also acceptable to the party elders and the like, and no doubt his background helped him in that respect. But they did not foresee, and certainly I think he had a mandate to tighten the system, but he did not come in my view, with a mandate to do what he's done. Okay, so if the compromise candidate becomes such an uncompromising leader, what's the reason for that? I think there are a number of things we need to look at. I think the first thing, quite obviously, is the Bolshevik case, followed by the Zhou Yongkang case. If you look at the official reason that they were toppled was fraud. It's the usual range of charges when you get a corruption case in China. It ranged from fraud to amoral womanizing, or licentious behavior. In other words, a combination of criminal behavior and behavior which breaches party discipline. That's the first thing. But I think later on, I think it's the much more serious charges against them, and you see this in the official media now. That's backed up by talking to people within China itself. The idea that Bolshevik and Zhou Yongkang were trying to sort of mount some kind of internal coup against Xi Jinping himself. So if you're worried, if you're Xi Jinping and you're coming into power and you find that in the process some of the most senior members of the Politburo are in fact conspiring against you, that, I think, would set you off, and that's certainly what appears to have happened. On top of that, I think that threat triggered broader concerns within the Communist Party, that the pillars of the party power, the various departments, the SOEs, were all crumbling, and the like. I think also underestimated, and I think there's been some good work on this recently. There's a lot of anger. There was a lot of anger by the end of the 2 5-year term of the Hu Wen administration from the so-called, neo-left, neo-Maoists, that China wasn't responding strongly to outside aggression, that China had a weak nation psychology, as a friend of mine put it. Most people look at the 2008 Olympic Games in Beijing and see them as a great triumph. I think the sort of new left and neo-Maoists saw this sort of, overheated fizz of, nationalism much more as a sign of weakness. Tellingly also, when Xi came to power, he didn't bask in the, how much of a stronger nation he was leading. He sent all the officials, once again, to go back and study the fall of the Soviet Union. Now, we all know that in the early to mid-90s, Chinese officials all had to do the same, go back and study what had happened in the Soviet Union. I find it pretty amazing, since the early to mid-90s, the Chinese economy had grown 24-fold, absolutely outstandingly successful on any terms, despite all the problems. But even then, every cadre worth their salt had to go back to study sessions again on the Soviet Union. In that respect, I think Xi Jinping is much like Vladimir Putin. He mourned the fall of the Soviet Union for the same reasons that he's always refused to disown and disavow Mao Zedong. To quote his speech in 2012 in Shenzhen, soon after he came to power, to dismiss the history of the Soviet Union and the Soviet Communist Party, to dismiss Lenin and Stalin, to dismiss everything else is to engage in historic nihilism. As the old saying goes, China might have rid itself in the reform period of many of its scriptures, but it makes sure to hang on to its saints. So Xi believes in the centrality and indeed the supremacy of the party. He believed it was under threat, and I think that tells you a lot as to why he came to office with such a frenzy of action. In fact, he was out of the gates in his first 100, 200 days with a speed I don't think that's been matched by any Chinese leader since 1949. So that brings me to the second thing, continuity versus disruption. I think we're all familiar with the tale of Xi the disruptor, overturning party norms to keep himself in power, trashing or ignoring China's long-standing positioning abroad to maintain a low profile and not challenge the United States. But in many areas of policy, both within China and abroad, I think Xi really represents continuity as much as he does disruption, and in fact I think the two go hand in hand. To give you a literary allusion, I think Xi is much like the prince in the fabled Sicilian novel The Leopard, who says the only way to maintain his family's power is to upend the existing social structures. Or, as that famous quote in that book goes, everything needs to change so everything can stay the same. To give you some examples, Xi built massive new islands in the South China Sea. He flexes the country's muscles by having his navy challenge any foreign ships which sail nearby. He unilaterally declared the air defense zone near Japan and South Korea, something, by the way, which the PLA had asked Hu Jintao to do, but he'd always resisted doing. None of these policies are new. Xi simply had the boldness, ability to implement them. If you just look back, for example, compare the period when Hu Jintao came to office and when Xi Jinping came to office. When Hu Jintao came to office, China had just joined the WTO. No matter what we say now, that the success was not guaranteed at the time. I was talking to one of our friends here last night about the coming collapse of China, that famous book. That book was predicated, if it was predicated on anything, it's actually a pretty sloppy book, but if that book was predicated on anything, it was the belief that Chinese companies would collapse in the face of competition from the global economy. And of course, that turned out not to be true. I might say you still see the author every day on Twitter and on Fox News, and he's still waiting to be proved right. Other of Chinese aims, South China Sea, I mentioned, East China Sea, Taiwan. I think they're all handled differently, more assertively now, and that is not because Xi is pursuing different policies, it's because he has the capability to pursue different policies. And I think the changing capability obviously has given us a much clearer, much greater clarity about Chinese intent. And that's what I mean, partly what I mean by about continuity through disruption. How has Xi Jinping pulled this off? He not only believes in the party, obviously, I think he believes in the power of the party, and most importantly, the executive power which resides in the hands of the party secretary, should they choose to use it, and should they be able to use it. The anti-corruption campaign, I think, is the classic example of that. If you wield your powers effectively, you can really do what you like. I mean, I don't want to get into this debate about whether she is a dictator or not, but at various times in your administration, you can be a dictator. And that's, has a number of implications. It secures, re-secures or re-cements central party rule. It re-cements and re-secures your own position in the party. Now, obviously, within China itself, as far as the bureaucracy and the policy-making process goes, it's more difficult to judge the long-term impact of that. If you talk about the anti-corruption campaign, there's two views on how that plays out. It either calcifies the bureaucracy and makes bureaucrats fearful of offering anything up above the line. But from the centre's point of view, it's actually a fantastic policy-making weapon, particularly in economic policy-making, because you can finally get things done that you want to have done, and that you're less likely to be stymied down the line. In any case, Xi has been disruptive within the system. He has been a fearful leader within the system, and that means he's made lots and lots of enemies. Now, in a rather crass, oversimplified way, I divide them into good enemies, bad enemies. So the bad enemies are the victims of the anti-corruption campaign. If you just think about the 400 members of the nomenklatura, multiply them all by 100. So if you think of every one of those people wields a vast patronage network, they have a lot of money, they have a lot of people who, a lot of power, a lot of prestige. They have people who invest their money on their behalf. They have people who invest money alongside them. They have family members who form part of their network. So if you're going to simply wipe the board of these people in any political system, let alone China's, you are going to leave behind a huge number of once powerful and probably still powerful in some respect enemies who will bide their time to get their revenge. And as we've seen with all campaigns, in big political campaigns in China since 1949, they have a long tail, and they can come back many years later to hurt you. That's the bad enemies. The good enemies, I'm oversimplifying, are what we might call the technocratic elite, who've been angry at a number of issues. They've been angry at the way the sort of space for civil society, rights lawyers, media, the professions generally has been rolled back. They've been angry about economic policy making with the overemphasis on the state instead of the private sector. They've been angry at the sort of quelling of legal reform, in other words, an attempt to institutionalize some kind of legal system. I think many of them have also been critics of the BRI. That's underestimated. Foreign criticism of the BRI has been very helpful to these people to get BRI wound back as well. And of course, all of that is wrapped up in the one policy decision which people are most angry about, and that is his refusal to appoint a successor. Now, I'll say two things about that. I think it's quite possible the issue of succession will come back before 2022, the next party congress. Secondly, why did he do that? I think it sounds a little bit medieval, but I think having been so disrupted within the party that there's really no off-ramp for Xi Jinping. In other words, it's dangerous for him to step down. Because if he steps down, then his acolytes, his followers, his patronage network, his officials, his loyalists, maybe his family as well, are also in danger of being locked up or targeted in one way or another. So that all boils down to a leader who's under great pressure. I might say that China is good at absorbing pressures, but that does not mean we should not examine them. So we've got great internal tensions at a time when the economy, which is I think the key to the CCP's future, the economy is slowing naturally. It's slowing or has slowed as a result of deliberate policy in deleveraging. It's under greater pressure because of the US-China trade dispute. All difficult things to manage. There's greater signs of financial instability. The first bank closure, I think, in July, 2 other banks which have had to have been cleaned up since then, a record number of bond defaults, etc., etc. I'm not saying we're about to get a financial collapse or something like that, but we're seeing the strains of the financial system, and certainly we should see that if the economy is slowing as well. All of this while we're on the cusp of a demographic crunch. I think China loses about 170 million people of working age population in the next 20 years. And it's at a time when I think China has done well, but not as well as it would have liked. For example, the PRC compared to Japan, China is still relatively poor. I think about 30% of American GDP per capita adjusted for purchasing power, according to the IMF. When Japan hit a similar milestone, it kept expanding at more than 9% annually for another 2 decades. South Korea, 7.7%. Taiwan, Singapore, 8.5% respectively. So the old adage, is China getting old before it's getting rich? I think is yes. On top of that, we have Hong Kong. I'll be very interested to hear what people have heard about Hong Kong. It's the nature of the Chinese system. You get all sorts of weird rumours. One, of course, is that Hong Kong is great for Xi Jinping because he can say, look, you want democracy? Have a look at this. That's democracy for you. That's one rumour. The other rumour, of course, is the absolute opposite of that, which is you have Xi Jinping's enemies stirring up things in Hong Kong to make him look bad and powerless. If you come back to the old adage of Chinese politics, all rumours are true. I can't square those two at the same time. We've got the Taiwan election coming up. These days nobody should predict the results of any elections, but certainly the DPP candidate, President Tsai, is looking very strong. Xi Jinping wants to have as his legacy, at the very least, the start of some sort of political talks over Taiwan. It's very difficult to see how that's brought about without the kind of pressure that will create even further pushback around the world. We get a lot of sloppy talk about China invading Taiwan and all that sort of thing. I really don't see that. And even if you think that through, does it take 1 day? Does it take 30 days? Does America get there in time, etc., etc.? No doubt China can get a comprador into the presidential palace one way or the other. But as Hong Kong shows, once you take Taiwan, that's when your problems start, not when they finish. So Taiwan, I think, remains an almost intractable issue for Beijing. Then there's the backlash overseas. I try to tell people in Australia, we still have a very insular culture down there. It's quite an isolated place. Having flown 24 hours to get here, I can just affirm that point. But I try to tell people, it's not just Australia. You look all around the world, everybody in one way or another is renegotiating, repositioning themselves on China, some more noisily than others, but most importantly, the US, of course. So let me just finish on one point related to the US and Mr. Trump. I've done pretty well, I've got to say. I haven't mentioned the word Trump until right to the end of my speech. I think about 18 months ago when the first round of tariffs were imposed on China, I think Trump's tactics, whether he really realized it or not, were actually working quite well. I think that he quite destabilized the Chinese leadership. They did not know how to handle him, which when you think about it, it's not surprising. They didn't know what he was going to do. The person sitting outside Mr. Trump's office didn't know what he was going to do. So how could they? But I think the fact that he went through the first round of tariffs, then quickly the second round of tariffs, the Chinese leaders were really put into a corner and struggled. I think now they've realised correctly that it's pointless doing a big deal with Trump. Maybe they'll get to the phase 1 deal soon. It's unpredictable, but after that we won't see much more, because from their point of view, maybe particularly going into a US election year, it's pointless to try and negotiate something much bigger. But for me, in any case, when we look back on this year in history, one of the signal moments might be in May this year, when the Politburo met to consider the lengthy document, draft document of a deal with the United States. I think it was about 150, 160 pages long. You'll all remember by the end of that Politburo meeting, it had been cut in half, sent back to the Americans, who said, what on earth is this? And that's when the talks fell apart. Now, speculatively, but there's been quite an unusual amount of briefing about what happened in May when the Chinese decided they couldn't go through with such a deal of such dimensions. Of course, Liu He was the hand-picked negotiator on behalf of Xi Jinping. He came to the Politburo to report on the deal. As I understand it, and as others have been told as well, there was an uprising, if you like, a revolt in the Politburo, which Xi Jinping got wind of and therefore allowed to proceed. And he allowed the Politburo, even sort of such meek functionaries like Han Zhen, who used to be the party secretary in Shanghai, he allowed them to basically turn on Liu He and attack him for giving too much away, for agreeing to all manner of things which they should never have agreed to because it was too humiliating, for committing to legislative timetables to meet American goals and the like. That this was far too reaching a deal, too much of a far-reaching deal, far too humiliating for China to take on. And by the end of it, as I said, they'd gone from 150 pages to 70 pages, and the basically negotiation with the US had died down. Was over. So if that's true, I think it's interesting in this respect, because that was very much a Politburo in which Xi Jinping was first amongst equals. It wasn't a Politburo under the rule of one person doing what they were told. And if that's the case, it may be that's the moment when Xi Jinping had his wings clipped and had to come back and work more closely with his colleagues. The final point, of course, is that if that's true, then the default mode of the Politburo, particularly if they're taking on Xi Jinping, is not to be more accommodating to the West, not to be less nationalistic, it's the opposite. It's, in other words, the way to attack Xi was to come from his, I don't know, right or left flank, whatever, but to come at him from a more nationalistic posture, because it's sort of position that can gain you brownie points within the system, not the other way around, even if Xi Jinping is pushing slightly in the other direction. So on that point, I'll finish. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard, for that. Thank you, Richard, for that brilliant analysis of Xi Jinping and the Chinese power, how Xi Jinping unexpectedly emerged as the strong leader of China, how he represents both continuity and disruption, and how, more recently, the generating backlash, not only domestically but also overseas. Richard has agreed to take a few questions. Since time is limited, so we'll just limit it to 3-4 questions. Floor is open for questions or comments. Please identify yourself and keep your question or comment as brief as possible.
Okay.
Right side. Right button.
Yes, our technology is always an issue. Okay, there we are. Harvard Asia Global Institute, University of Hong Kong. A very brief question on your last comment. It's almost sounded as if Xi Jinping is the victim of a faction within the Politburo rather than the driver. You suggested that he had to backtrack, suggesting that he would have liked a different course. Is that so?
Can you combine two more questions?
Sure.
Anup and then Ravi. Yeah.
Thank you very much, for the proposal. Thank you very much. I enjoyed that a lot. Let me ask you one question.
Please identify yourself.
Sorry, I'm Anup Singh. I'm currently with the 15th Finance Commission in the Government of India. One question, since we are into almost 2020, can we therefore infer that the international context of a US deal is going to be left behind for China and is not going to be the main force being used by the opponents of Xi Jinping? And if that is the case, is therefore the main problem for Xi Jinping the economy? Because at a growth of 5.5 to 6, we know that much of this is being achieved not only because we wanted to slow, but mainly because it's being achieved by continuing to increase credit and debt-driven growth. And is that where the problem really is in the next 9 months for him? Ravi?
Thank you for a very brilliant exposition. I'm Ravi Bhuthalingam, Institute of Chinese Studies. My question, in fact, the two small subparts. One is, Xi Jinping has studied Chinese history and is very familiar with the various patterns and circulations of the history. And he knows that those who have absolute power discourage honest feedback to the person who wields that power. And therefore, very often, the person wielding power is cut out from the stream of information, which in turn then leads to mistakes and missteps. And particularly, as she has done, and as you pointed out, if you open too many fronts, the economic front, Xinjiang, Hong Kong, South China Sea, and so on, you also expand the number of areas where these mistakes can happen. So how is Xi, in his own exercise of power, how does he kind of plan? Does he have a plan? Or does he have a sort of way in which he's going to manage these two dangers?
Arthur?
Mr. Really, you provide a very good medicine. But I would like to make a analogy, because in the year 2000, Zhu Rongji pushed very hard for entering the WTO. And he said he got a lot of criticism internally, but he said that let me prepare 100 coffee, one for me and the other 99 for others. Then he pushed and he successfully made it. So can you compare these two cases? Why Zhu Rongji made it, and in this time, Xi Jinping failed?
Good morning, I'm Admiral Chopra. I just wanted to know if there is adequate support for Xi within the PLA as of the moment? And as a corollary, does the support of the PLA or otherwise even matter in today's context in the CCP of today as opposed to the past? Thank you.
Alexis.
Okay, yeah. I really do appreciate your brilliant speech, and I'm Alex Maslow. Yeah. Right, yeah. I'm Alex Maslow from the High School of Economics, Russia. In the searching for the new stability for China, do you think that Xi Jinping will increase the capacity of the collaboration with Russia, or Xi Jinping or China in general will be searching for the new partners outside of United States and Russia? Do you think that China will be possible to complete the establishment of so-called the Pax China or something like this? Thank you.
Get back to you.
Okay, that is 7 questions. I'll answer them all at once. Oh, sorry. Okay, sorry, that is 7 questions. I'll do my best to answer them. First, on the issue, is he a victim of a backlash? I wouldn't say that. I don't want to exaggerate my knowledge, you know. I don't want to be like one of those books at Hong Kong airport, you know, pretending to know everything. But I think in that case, I think if Xi Jinping recognized the coming tide, I think what he did was rush to get ahead of it, you know, rush to the top of the nationalistic mountaintop to make sure he occupied it, and basically threw his negotiator to the wolves. Whether he or her had gone beyond his negotiating mandate, I don't know, but he must have felt he could have to have done what he did, and certainly Mr. Lighthizer in America, his counterpart, thought he did. But I think she, you know, sniffed the breeze, I'd say that, would say why he's a very good gut politician, and got there, made sure he was there before his critics were. Second question, yeah, I think US-China on the economy is probably the least of the issues creating downward pressure on the economy. You know, I think that they're working out now what the headline growth will be. Maybe the headline growth figure for the economy is the least indicative figure you can get, but it's indicative politically. I don't think it matters if China grows 5%, that's no big deal, except it's a big deal if you set a signal where it's a much slower rate around the country. I would have thought that the current level of growth is less credit-driven than, say, 10 years ago. But that doesn't mean once you do slow down, you get all manner of things showing up that were otherwise camouflaged. But there's probably some people in the room who know better than I than that. By the way, I noticed today that in theory the headline rate has to be 6% to meet the target of doubling the economy by the end of next year. I think with the recent revamp of GDP figures, apparently you can now have 5.5%. I think there's a lot more appetite amongst the leadership for lower headline growth. We'll see whether that's the case next March. Chinese history, closed decision-making, Xi Jinping. I think in any political system where you have decision-making clustered amongst a small group of people, you get more mistakes. Now, I don't know enough as to whether he's shut off from, you know, you hear lots of stories, nobody will bring him bad news, but I think anybody can get on the internet these days. He's got a daughter. It's hard to hide stuff. You can't hide Trump and his tweets from Xi Jinping. One story, a lot of Americans have told me that when they go to see senior Chinese officials these days, the senior Chinese officials will provoke them into saying very tough things, which are then all written down and taken up, which is one way of communicating with a leader when you don't want to say it directly yourself. Arthur, on your point about Zhirongji's famous comment about 100 coffins, I thought the 100 coffins was about corrupt local officials more than WTO. I guess the two go together in some respects, in as, you know, it's shaking up the system to prepare the Chinese economy for the WTO. But I don't think that even, and if I'm not misinterpreting your question, I don't think Xi even thought that China would necessarily do well. In other words, him and Long Yong-tu, his chief negotiator, certainly thought they were taking big risks in doing what they did. Of course, in the 100 coffins, as we all know, with Zhurong-Ji, many local officials had prepared a coffin for Zhu himself, which thankfully he evaded. PLA, I'm not a military expert, so I'm not going to pretend. I think if you sack 100 generals and you put a lot of people in place, I think you've got their loyalty. Actually, I quite understand a clean out of the type that he did. Many of the top people were engaging in an age-old practice, but nonetheless from the very top of selling commissions. In other words, they've taken over or the human resources function within the party and were using it to make money, monetizing it. So you'd think if he wants to build the PLA into a fighting force, in other words, have the personnel to do it, not just the hardware, then you can understand why he did it. And yes, I think it matters very much. Still, if you look at Zhou Yongkang, for example, some of the things he was up to with Bo Xilai down in Sichuan and further south, when they were sort of meeting secretly or off diary with senior generals, I think it would make you paranoid pretty quickly. The last question, other partners besides Russia, obviously you would know more about China-Russia than me. I think it's been a much stronger, much more enduring relationship than many thought, obviously because of the US and what the US said in 2017 on revisionist powers. But who are China's partners? Their security allies, North Korea. As somebody said, the sort of friend you have when you've run out of enemies. I think it's fascinating to look at the recent statements on Xinjiang, where China is treated like a football match. Yes, you've got 22 criticizing us, but we've now got 76 supporting us. But they're not the partners they really want at the end of the day. They would like to be aligned with and respected by and trading with the big powers in the world. Not rounding up other countries to support them. Maybe I'm wrong, maybe that's the future they see for themselves. But I think in the Xinjiang statements you see a very interesting bifurcation of the world, and within that, leaving aside Pakistan, which is obviously a case in itself, and Southeast Asia is a bit different, but China's still learning how to work alongside countries as a hegemon, as a partner, as a friend, and as a powerful country, and they're on a steep learning curve and kind of at the bottom.
Thank you, Richard. Please join me in giving a big round of applause for. Now we come to the last set of remarks of the inaugural session. I'll request Mr. Peter Remele, country head Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, to deliver the concluding remarks.
Dear Ambassador Shokanta, dear Professor Varunzani, Mr. Richard McGregor, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, and friends. Am I ever glad that I can talk to friends and I don't have to distinguish between bad and good enemies. It's also nice that we can enjoy our event, and the special spirit was mentioned by Varunzani, in an India-governed Goa, also a result of a change of geopolitics taking place some decades ago. So geopolitics is permanently changing with different influence factors. It's an honor and privilege alike to extend a warm and hearty welcome to you all who have come together from different directions even different continents. To the third India Forum on China. It's my pleasure to have the opportunity to participate in this excellent event and benefit from the knowledge and experience of our experts. All discussants will debate in the coming days different dimensions of China and Asia's changing geopolitics, which not only impact the direct neighborhood, but whose influence can be increasingly felt in Europe too. During the 5th Indo-German government consultations held in the beginning of November 2019, the special relationship between India and Germany was once again emphasized. 17 agreements were signed between India and Germany in fields ranging from agriculture to maritime technology, among others. During the high-ranking delegation's visit, led by our Chancellor Merkel herself, who was accompanied by cabinet ministers, state secretaries and business delegations, the visit turned out to be symptomatic for the strong bilateral ties that already exist between the two countries. At this particular point of time, where China's and Asia's change in geopolitics is felt worldwide, a close relationship between like-minded partner countries, such as the one between Germany and India, but of course this is only an example, many others are there, but this is strongly needed, in particular within the context of multilateral institutions. While the Indo-Pacific is an indispensable connector, conflicting security perceptions in the Indo-Pacific region remain a fact. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, enhancing connectivity and power station in Pakistan, puts India in a difficult position that it will have to contend with China much more than ever before. Moreover, countries in the region can also no longer depend on some kind of US security umbrella, but that is true for Europe as well, which consequently creates a scenario that calls for strengthening connectivity in the region. In this context, mutual trust among the actors is the key now and will be also so in the future. This is also the case when it comes to Indo-German relations, while another crucial basis has been laid in the beginning of November during the Indo-German government consultations and in 2018 with the release of the EU strategy on India. Concrete initiatives on various levels and in different fields are awaited and would prove decisive in bringing Europe and Asia closer together in a time characterized even more than ever before by global insecurity. Before we now delve at the end of the inaugural session into the first panel, I'd like to thank Ambassador Shokanta, Director of the Institute of Chinese Studies, and Professor Varunzani, Vice Chancellor of the Goa University, for their partnership in organizing this highly intriguing conference, which never ceases to address topics of current relevance. It is really a pleasure for us to partner in this conference with you for the third time now, and it's my sincere wish that we can strengthen our cooperation further in the future. I think you had addressed that before, Ambassador. Similarly, I'd like to thank all the chairs and speakers, and of course, first of all, Richard McGregor, who just has enlightened us with deep insights into a special perspective of China, and to all those who have contributed or will contribute in the next few days to this event. The Konrad Adenauer Foundation, which I represent, is a German political foundation which has been active in India since 1968. The foundation runs more than 20 offices within the Indo-Pacific region today, and recognizing the growing importance of the region, KAS has just opened its office in Australia to listen more to what we have to say there. So that is also a sign that we are interested in the region and that we are doing research in the Indo-Pacific and into its issues to further strengthen Germany's understanding of the region. Today, we are active in almost every Asian country and thus are able to observe and pay attention to the transition in the region it's undergoing in our daily work. The rapid changes taking place in Asia, especially in China and India, are altering the global balance of power. Not only for Germany, but also for many other countries, this development brings uncertainty as well as opportunities and also risks. To what extent is Asia's geopolitical future characterized by the China factor? What's the status of the Belt and Road Initiative? Where can the economic and strategic rivalry between the US and China lead to, and what will follow after India's pullout of RCEP? If I look back in Europe, let's say the last decade, we really had some kind of China hype. And the strategy or the perception was if China prospers, there will also democracy develop. Richard McGregor has explained before why this did not take place, so I leave that one there. And so the perception is also changing because, let me say it this way, China has somehow pulled the leg of its trading partners for a long time, and that also leads into changed perception of them. We are here in a beach resort. I have noticed there are two weddings taking place last night. Another one was prepared this morning. If I look into India's neighbors, the immediate neighbor countries, I leave Pakistan out of this view, then India has always regarded its immediate neighbor countries as its natural backyard of influence. Let me say those are bygone times, at least I think most would agree with me. Those countries now, coming back to the weddings, are somehow in the position of a bride, where several suitors around are interested in having closer ties, India and China being maybe the most important ones. So, of course, from a perception of a bride, the neighboring countries are in a good position. They can look, what do the other ones offer? If I see what China has done in investment, in infrastructure projects, in oil, then probably I would come to the conclusion that India would have to dig much deeper in its pocket to catch up with such development projects if it wants to not keep but regain its influence in these countries. And as I said before, influence is always a factor of shaping geopolitics as well. On this note, once again, my thanks go to partners, to the co-organizers of this event, to speakers, guests. It's my great pleasure to warmly welcome you again, and I'm looking forward to fruitful discussions. We already had them, but we will continue, and of course, constructive results. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Peter Remele, for those thoughtful remarks and for bringing up some important questions that we can deliberate upon. Well, now this brings to an end the inaugural session